I have presided over thousands of disputes in my career, cases of genuine hardship, cases of accidental harm, and cases where pure greed overshadowed basic human decency. But every so often, a person walks into my courtroom utterly convinced they are smarter than the system, smarter than the plaintiff, and absolutely smarter than the judge sitting on the bench. This was one of those unforgettable cases. Even now, years after the gavel fell, I can vividly recall the young man sitting at the defense table. He was leaning back in his chair, arms casually crossed, wearing an expensive tailored suit and a smirk that seemed permanently etched onto his face. He believed he was completely untouchable. He believed his elaborate web of lies was impenetrable. Little did he know, the very technology he used to flaunt his supposed genius would soon become the exact weapon that destroyed his entire fabricated narrative. His name was Marcus Vance, 26 years old, smooth-talking, with the kind of polished arrogance that usually masks a profound lack of character. The complaint on my desk involved a severe personal injury and fraud claim. Marcus was suing his former landlord, a hard-working older gentleman named Arthur Pendelton. Marcus claimed that a slip and fall on Arthur's property had left him with debilitating, lifelong back injuries. According to the thick medical file submitted by his attorney, Marcus was supposedly unable to work, unable to walk without severe pain, and was demanding a massive financial settlement that would have effectively bankrupted Arthur. As I took my seat on the bench and began reviewing the preliminary documents, I observed Marcus carefully. Years on the bench teach you to read the silent language of a courtroom, the subtle behaviors that people exhibit when they think nobody is paying attention. A truly injured person, someone whose life has been genuinely upended by chronic pain and physical trauma, carries a specific, heavy weight. They look exhausted. They look desperate for a fair resolution. Marcus, however, looked like he was waiting for a punchline. While Arthur sat rigidly at the plaintiff's table, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he clutched his meager defense file, Marcus was whispering something to his attorney and actually rolling his eyes at the proceedings. It was a display of blatant disrespect. I paused the proceedings before the attorneys even had the chance to utter their opening statements. The courtroom fell dead silent. "Is there something you find amusing about this lawsuit, Mr. Vance?" I asked, my voice cutting through the heavy tension of the room. His smug smile didn't waver for a second. "Not at all, Your Honor. Just ready to get this over with." But the contempt in his eyes told a completely different story. It was the undeniable look of a scammer who thought he had already won the game. What Marcus didn't realize was that I had already noticed the glaring inconsistencies in his timeline, and a single, thin manila folder sitting on the opposing counsel's table was about to wipe that arrogant smile off his face permanently. The plaintiff's attorney, a man who seemed to share his client's unwarranted confidence, stood to deliver the opening statement. He painted a tragic, almost theatrical portrait of Marcus Vance. According to this carefully constructed narrative, Marcus was a vibrant young professional whose promising life had been tragically derailed by a puddle of untreated water on Arthur Pendelton's property. The claims were extensive: severe lumbar trauma, an inability to lift more than 10 pounds, and chronic, debilitating pain that supposedly required the constant use of a mobility aid. In fact, Marcus had limped into my courtroom that morning leaning heavily on a polished wooden cane. He handled it with the dramatic flair of a seasoned actor playing a part, but decades on the bench give you a sixth sense for deception. When someone truly lives with chronic physical pain, they don't forget their injury the moment they believe the spotlight is off. Before the bailiff had even called the room to order, I had quietly observed Marcus twist his upper torso to retrieve a dropped pen from the floor. The movement was fluid, effortless, and entirely inconsistent with a man claiming catastrophic spinal damage. He was playing a role, and he firmly believed he was putting on a flawless performance. Across the aisle, Arthur Pendelton sat silently absorbing the heavy accusations. He was a retired mechanic who had poured his entire life savings into a small duplex to fund his modest retirement. He looked physically diminished by the sheer stress of the lawsuit. He wasn't backed by a flashy, expensive legal team. He had a quiet defense attorney and a mountain of visible anxiety. When the plaintiff's attorney read the multi-million-dollar damage demand aloud, Arthur closed his eyes and let out a slow, shaky breath. The emotional and physical toll this trial was taking on him was raw and genuine. And Marcus? I watched Marcus closely at that exact moment. He smirked. It was a tiny, fleeting curl of the lip, directed right at the older man. It was a look of pure, predatory satisfaction. He wasn't just trying to win a massive financial settlement, he was actively enjoying the process of breaking an innocent man down. I have seen that mentality before. It is the hallmark of someone who views other human beings merely as stepping stones for their own greed. But Arthur's defense attorney, a quiet, unassuming woman named Miss Gallagher, didn't look panicked. When it was her turn to address the court, she didn't offer a passionate denial or a long-winded counter-narrative. Instead, she stood calmly, adjusted her glasses, and stated that the defense would rely entirely on the plaintiff's own documented timeline. The very timeline Marcus thought he had perfected. The plaintiff's case began exactly as I expected, with a carefully rehearsed performance. When Marcus was called to the witness stand, the brief, effortless agility I had witnessed earlier completely vanished. Suddenly, every step was a monumental effort. He gripped his wooden cane with white knuckles, dragging his left leg as if it were made of lead. He winced audibly as he lowered himself into the witness chair, adjusting his posture with dramatic grimaces of pain. His attorney walked him through the day of the incident. Marcus described slipping on a patch of poorly maintained ice outside Arthur's duplex. He spoke of a blinding flash of agony, a shattered spine, and a future stolen from him. For nearly an hour, he painted a masterpiece of misery. He testified under oath that since the day of the fall, which occurred exactly 11 months prior, he had been virtually bedridden. He claimed he could not drive, could not stand for more than 10 minutes, and certainly could not travel, socialize, or engage in any physical activity whatsoever. "My life is effectively over," Marcus stated, his voice trembling with a practiced, hollow sorrow. "I spend my days staring at the ceiling, in constant pain, wondering why Mr. Pendleton couldn't just salt his walkway." I scanned the jury box. Several jurors looked genuinely moved. Marcus was an articulate young man, and his tale of stolen youth was inherently sympathetic. But from my vantage point on the bench, I could see the cracks in the mask. Whenever his attorney turned away to retrieve a document, Marcus's sorrowful expression would instantly go blank. His eyes were sharp, calculating, darting toward the jury to gauge their reaction before snapping back into a look of agony. It was the performance of a con artist checking his marks. Then, it was time for cross-examination. Miss Gallagher, Arthur's quiet defense attorney, approached the lectern. She didn't carry a massive stack of medical files or launch into hostile accusations. She carried a single, thin, legal pad. "Mr. Vance," she began, her voice steady and unfailingly polite, "you testified today that since the accident 11 months ago, your physical condition has made it impossible for you to travel, exercise, or leave your home for anything other than medical appointments. Is that absolutely correct?" Marcus leaned into the microphone, his smug confidence returning just a fraction. He looked at her as if she were a nuisance, swatting at his brilliant plan. "Yes, ma'am. I haven't been able to live a normal life. I'm trapped in my own body." "And you understand that you are under oath?" she pressed gently. Marcus rolled his eyes, a brief, dismissive flutter directed at the ceiling, accompanied by an arrogant sigh. "Obviously, yes, I'm disabled." It was a tiny gesture of contempt. But in a courtroom, contempt is the match that lights the powder keg. Miss Gallagher didn't flinch at his disrespect. She simply nodded, turned to me, and asked permission to introduce the defense's first piece of physical evidence. "Your Honor, the defense would like to submit Exhibit A into evidence," Miss Gallagher stated, her voice echoing in the sudden quiet of the courtroom. She handed a bound folder to the bailiff, who passed it up to my bench. A duplicate was placed directly in front of Marcus and his attorney. I watched Marcus's reaction closely. When defendants who are lying are suddenly presented with unexpected physical evidence, their eyes almost always betray them. Marcus glanced down at the closed folder. For a fraction of a second, the smugness vanished, replaced by a sharp, calculating glint. He leaned over and whispered frantically to his lawyer. His attorney, who had been oozing confidence just moments before, flipped open the cover of the folder and visibly stiffened. "Mr. Vance," Miss Gallagher continued, walking slowly toward the center of the room, "you are quite active on social media, aren't you? Specifically, on an application called Instagram." Marcus scoffed, gripping his wooden cane tighter. "I have an account. Mostly I just scroll. Like I said, I'm stuck in bed. I don't have much else to do." "And your account is set to private, correct?" she asked. "Yes, obviously. I value my privacy." The arrogant smirk returned to his face. He felt safe. In his mind, a private account meant an impenetrable fortress. He believed that because his profile was locked, His secrets were securely locked away with it. This is a common, catastrophic misconception among scammers in the modern digital age. They conveniently forget that the internet is written in ink and that mutual acquaintances can easily take screenshots. Miss Gallagher pressed a button on a remote, and the large monitor facing the jury box flickered to life. Your Honor, these are authenticated screenshots captured from the plaintiff's private account, provided to us by a mutual acquaintance who was deeply disturbed by the nature of this lawsuit. The first image appeared on the screen. It wasn't the most devastating piece of evidence I knew from glancing at the master folder that there was much worse to come, but it was more than enough to establish a clear pattern of perjury. The photograph showed Marcus standing perfectly upright, smiling broadly, and hoisting a heavy-looking piece of designer luggage in an airport terminal. No cane, no grimace of pain. The digital date stamp on the authenticated post was exactly 3 months after the slip-and-fall incident that had supposedly left him completely bedridden. Mr. Vance? Miss Gallagher asked, her tone entirely devoid of sarcasm, but heavy with implication. Can you explain to this court how a man with a shattered spine, who just testified under oath that he cannot lift more than 10 pounds, managed to casually carry a heavy suitcase through an airport? The courtroom held its collective breath. Arthur Pendelton looked up, his exhausted eyes widening. Marcus opened his mouth to speak, but for the first time all morning, no words came out. For several agonizing seconds, the only sound in the courtroom was the low, steady hum of the ventilation system. Marcus Vance, the man who had spent the entire morning painting himself as a tragically disabled victim, stared at the monitor with his mouth slightly open. The smugness had evaporated instantly, replaced by the frantic, wide-eyed look of a cornered animal realizing the trap had snapped shut. That was, Marcus stammered, his polished, smooth-talking demeanor shattering completely under the weight of reality. The suitcase was empty. I was just moving it for a friend. It was a good day. I had a brief window where the pain medication was working. It was a pathetic, desperate pivot, the kind of transparent lie a person invents when their brain is short-circuiting under immense pressure. Juries and judges are not easily fooled by the good day defense when it directly contradicts months of sworn, documented testimony claiming total, unrelenting paralysis and an inability to lift a simple textbook. Miss Gallagher didn't interrupt his fumbling explanation. She allowed him to speak, letting the sheer absurdity of his words hang in the silent courtroom so everyone could fully absorb the lie. Then, with the precise, methodical timing of an expert litigator, she pressed the button on her remote and advanced to the next slide in Exhibit A. A brief window of feeling better, you say? She asked, her voice remaining perfectly calm and unfazed. Let us look at the next piece of evidence, captured exactly 2 days after the airport photograph. The large monitor transitioned from a static image to a high-definition video. It was bright, sun-drenched, and unmistakable. It showed Marcus in Cabo San Lucas, but he wasn't resting on a lounge chair or being carefully assisted into a pool. He was on a jet ski. The video captured him aggressively, jumping ocean waves, twisting his upper torso with intense physical exertion, and laughing hysterically. He was navigating the water with the core strength of a seasoned athlete. There was no cane. There was no shattered spine. There was only an arrogant young man enjoying a lavish vacation, likely funded by credit cards in anticipation of the massive settlement he believed he was about to extract from an innocent older man. I watched Arthur Pendelton at the plaintiff's table. The retired mechanic let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. He buried his face in his trembling hands. It wasn't just relief washing over him. It was the visceral, overwhelming validation of knowing he wasn't going to lose his home, his life savings, or his hard-earned dignity to a fraud. I turned my attention back to the witness stand. Marcus had gone completely pale, his skin taking on a sickly, ashen hue. The confident, untouchable aura he had worn into my courtroom, like an expensive designer suit, was completely gone. He looked down at his lap, gripping his cane out of pure nervous habit, refusing to meet my eyes, refusing to look at the screen. But the digital footprint he thought he had cleverly hidden behind a privacy setting was playing on a continuous, damning loop for everyone to see. Mr. Vance, I said, my voice cutting sharply through the audio of the jet ski engine playing from the courtroom speakers. I am going to ask you a very simple question, and I strongly suggest you think very carefully before you answer it. Easy money. The 2 words hung in the sterile air of the courtroom, projecting from the large monitor like a neon sign of pure malice. I have seen many things in my decades on the bench, but the sheer, calculated cruelty of that single text message sent a visible shockwave through the jury box. Several jurors actually gasped. One woman in the front row crossed her arms and glared at Marcus with a look of undisguised contempt. At the defense table, Arthur Pendelton stared at the screen. The exhaustion that had weighed down his shoulders all morning seemed to suddenly lift, replaced by a quiet, dignified anger. He had spent 11 agonizing months losing sleep, terrified he would lose his home and his retirement to this young man. Now, he was looking at the undeniable proof that his suffering was nothing more than a strategic game for a greedy predator. Marcus Vance was completely paralyzed. The smirk was dead and buried. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then looked desperately at his attorney. I was joking, he stammered, his voice thin and reedy, entirely devoid of its earlier polished resonance. It was just dark humor with a buddy. It's being taken out of context. Out of context, Mr. Vance? I interrupted, my voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. I didn't yell. I didn't need to. When you have the absolute truth in front of you, a whisper is louder than a shout. You are attempting to convince this court that plotting to extort $500,000 from a retired mechanic while faking a catastrophic spinal injury is a form of comedy? His attorney finally spoke up, but not to defend his client. Your Honor, the lawyer said, his face flushed with profound professional embarrassment. The plaintiff's counsel would like to request a brief recess to confer with my client regarding his ongoing testimony. In courtroom translation, everyone knew exactly what that meant. I need to stop him before he incriminates us both any further. Request denied, I stated firmly. The time for conferring was over. The truth was out, and it demanded immediate accountability. Mr. Vance, you walked into my courtroom today believing that the law was a playground and that Mr. Pendleton was your personal ATM. You believed you were untouchable. You believed you could easily erase your digital footprints. I leaned forward, locking eyes with the defeated young man. But you forgot one crucial detail. Arrogance makes people sloppy. And your own words have not only destroyed your civil claim today, but they have opened a completely different door. I paused, letting the heavy gravity of the moment sink into the silent room. Because what we are looking at on this screen is no longer just a dismissed lawsuit. It is documented, undeniable evidence of attempted insurance fraud and blatant perjury. The color completely drained from Marcus's face as the word fraud echoed in the room. The realization finally hit him. He wasn't just walking away without a payday. He might not be walking away at all. The silence that followed was absolute. Marcus Vance, the young man who had strutted into my courtroom radiating untouchable arrogance, physically shrank into his chair. He looked wildly around the room, searching for a loophole, but found only the hardened stares of a jury that had just watched him attempt to destroy an innocent man's life for sport. His attorney slowly stood up, closing his legal pad with a heavy thud. Your Honor, he said, his voice completely devoid of its earlier theatrical flair. In light of this newly presented evidence, the plaintiff formally withdraws all claims. You cannot simply withdraw from a fraud you have already committed in my courtroom, I replied sharply, my gavel echoing like a final judgment. This case is dismissed with prejudice. Mr. Vance, you are hereby ordered to pay the entirety of Mr. Pendleton's legal fees and all associated court costs. Marcus flinched, but I wasn't finished. Furthermore, I continued, staring directly into his panicked eyes, I am instructing the court clerk to forward the complete transcripts of today's proceedings, along with Exhibit A, directly to the district attorney's office. Attempted extortion, insurance fraud, and blatant perjury are not childish mistakes. They are serious crimes with severe consequences. At the defense table, Arthur Pendelton wept openly. They were not tears of sorrow, but the profound release of a man who had just been given his life back. The heavy burden he had carried for 11 months vanished. Justice had been absolute. Before I adjourned, I looked out at the gallery. People often believe that clever lies and a polished image can outsmart the system. They believe their private conversations are erased, that their arrogance is a shield. But technology has a long memory, and character always reveals itself when you think nobody is watching. Marcus walked in laughing at the process, convinced he was the smartest person in the room. He wasn't defeated by a brilliant legal strategy. He was defeated by his own boundless ego, captured in digital ink. You can hide the truth for a little while, but eventually, it always finds its way back into the light. And when it does, the truth always wins.